How do you fool an entire army without firing a single bullet? How do you make the Third Reich's greatest military strategists believe in something that doesn't exist? In the spring of 1944, the Allies pulled off the most daring scam in the history of warfare. They created a ghost army out of rubber and plywood that fooled Hitler himself. This isn't the plot of a spy thriller. This is the true story of an operation that saved tens of thousands of lives and changed the course of World War II. Today, we'll tell you how inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and one brilliant Spanish spy tricked Nazi Germany into expecting an invasion where it never happened. 1944. Europe is bleeding under the oppression of Nazi occupation. The Soviet Union is slowly but inexorably pushing back the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, but the fate of the continent still hangs in the balance. The Allies, Britain, the United States, and their partners understand that the war cannot be won without opening a second front. A massive operation is needed, a strike at the very heart of Hitler's stronghold. The plan is grandiose. The Normandy landings, Operation Overlord, which will go down in history as D-Day. But there's a problem. The Germans know an invasion is inevitable. They are fortifying the Atlantic Wall, mining the beaches, and amassing troops. Any leak, any mistake, could turn the landing ships into floating coffins, and the French coast into a gigantic meat grinder. The Allied command understood that the success of the operation depended on more than just the bravery of its soldiers and the power of its equipment. Strategic surprise was essential. But how could preparations for the largest amphibious operation in history be concealed when German intelligence and agents were constantly monitoring British ports? How could a million-strong invasion force be assembled without revealing its intentions? The answer was found not on the battlefield, but in the offices of British intelligence. If preparations for an invasion could not be concealed, the enemy had to be convinced that the attack would come from a completely different location. Logic told the German command the obvious. The Allies would choose the shortest route across the English Channel. The Strait of Pas-de-Calais is the narrowest part of the strait, just 30 kilometers from the British coast. From here, a direct route to Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Basin, opens. Any sensible commander would have chosen precisely this route. And the Allies decided to use this logic against the Germans themselves. What if, instead of undermining their confidence, they bolstered it? What if they created an illusion so plausible that Hitler himself would believe it without a shadow of a doubt? In the winter of 1943, development of an unprecedented deception operation began in deep secrecy. The London Controlling Section, a secret group of Allied officers, began planning a grand deception, codenamed Bodyguard. This was an umbrella plan that concealed numerous individual operations, each playing its own role in the grand scheme. The most ambitious of these was Operation Fortitude, or Dream, as it is sometimes called. Its goal was simple in formulation, but fantastically complex in execution: to deceive the Nazis into believing that the main Allied attack would come on Norway and the Pas-de-Calais, while the real invasion would occur in Normandy. But how do you create the illusion of an invasion in two different places at once? How do you convince professional intelligence that the Allies are preparing an operation where there isn't one? The British understood. Deception had to be multi-layered, comprehensive, and completely believable. You couldn't simply send out fake dispatches. German intelligence wasn't stupid. You had to create an entire parallel reality, one in which armies exist that don't exist, commanders issue orders to non-existent divisions, and radio operators transmit the coordinates of phantom bases. And this reality had to be so convincing that even the most suspicious Abwehr officers wouldn't doubt its authenticity. Operation Fortitude was divided into two parts. Fortitude North was intended to create the threat of an invasion of occupied Norway, forcing the Germans to maintain significant forces there. But the main role was assigned to Fortitude South, an operation designed to create the illusion of a grand invasion of Pas-de-Calais. It was here that the Allies unfolded the largest theater of military absurdity in human history. It was here that an army was born that never existed, yet kept the entire Wehrmacht on edge. It was here that rubber tanks and wooden planes became weapons more terrifying than real guns. The Germans were about to see exactly what they expected, and the Allies gave them this spectacle in spades. Preparations began for the greatest deception of the 20th century, an operation that would require the participation of thousands of people, from senior generals to rank-and-file radio operators, from brilliant intelligence officers to brave double agents who risked their lives every day. Operation Fortitude had begun, the persistence of illusion against the reality of war. The best minds in British and American intelligence were behind Operation Fortitude. The chief architect of the deception was Colonel John Bevan, head of the London Controlling Section, a secret unit dedicated to strategic disinformation. Together with Noel Wild of the Allied General Staff, they developed the concept for the operation back in late 1943. But the initial plans were too simple, too obvious. Colonel David Strangeways, head of the deception section on Field Marshal Montgomery's staff, harshly criticized the proposed design and essentially rewrote the entire operation. His approach was revolutionary. The deception had to be not just plausible, it had to be indistinguishable from reality. Every detail, every element of the Phantom Army had to appear as if it really existed. The deception strategy was based on the principle of special means, the integrated use of physical disinformation, fake radio communications, diplomatic leaks, and double agents. This technique had been previously honed in North Africa by Officer Dudley Clark, whose A Force group had successfully deceived the Germans in the deserts of Egypt. Now these techniques had to be applied on a continental scale. The Allies understood that German intelligence, the Abwehr, was professional and experienced. It couldn't be fooled by a single trick. A multi-layered system of deception was needed, where each source of information, radio intercepts, intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance, diplomatic channels, would corroborate the same story. The centerpiece of Operation Fortitude South was the 1st U.S. Army Group, known by its acronym FUSAG. It was the largest Phantom Army in human history. On paper, it consisted of 11 divisions, tens of thousands of soldiers, and hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The headquarters of this imaginary armada was supposedly located in southeastern England, directly opposite the Pas-de-Calais. Most ingeniously, the Allies placed General George Patton, a legendary commander whom the Germans feared and respected more than any other Allied general, at the head of FUSAG. For the Wehrmacht, Patton's name was synonymous with aggression, audacity, and military genius. The German command was absolutely certain that where Patton was, there would be the main attack. But how could they create the illusion of an entire army's presence? They started with the most obvious, visual deception. In January 1944, as part of Operation Quicksilver, construction began on a gigantic military camp on the southeast coast of England. Except there were no troops there. Instead of real Sherman tanks, inflatable rubber replicas appeared in the fields. From a distance, especially from the air above a reconnaissance aircraft, they looked absolutely realistic. The inflatable tanks could be deployed in minutes and moved to new positions, creating the illusion of constant movement and regrouping of troops. Wooden mock-ups of artillery guns, made of plywood and canvas, were positioned next to them. The airfields were also fake. Wooden planes, constructed from beams and plywood, stood in neat rows on the runways. At night, special teams dragged car headlights back and forth along the airfield perimeter, simulating the movement of aircraft and preparation for takeoff. Entire warehouses were constructed from empty crates, and barracks from canvas tents where no one lived. In Dover, A team of set designers from the famous Shepperton Film Studios constructed a fake port complex with cranes, ammunition depots, and landing craft docks. All this splendor was deliberately left open to German aerial reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe regularly flew over southeast England, photographing the concentration of troops and reporting to Berlin. The Allies were preparing a large-scale operation against the Pas-de-Calais. But visual deception was only the first layer. The physical scenery alone could arouse suspicion. This phantom army needed to be brought to life, given a voice, made to breathe and move through the airwaves. And so began one of the most ingenious radio games in the history of warfare. The Allies created a whole network of false radio transmissions simulating fusag activity. Radio operators transmitted orders to non-existent battalions, coordinated the movement of phantom columns, and requested reinforcements for imaginary divisions. Each message was carefully calibrated to comply with standard Army communications procedures. German radio intelligence intercepted these transmissions and plotted the Allied positions on maps. And the maps showed exactly what the British intended: a colossal concentration of forces opposite the Pas-de-Calais. To make the deception even more convincing, the Allies didn't just feign preparation, they made it appear deliberately sloppy. German intelligence officers were deliberately allowed to intercept classified information, accidentally discover documents, and mistakenly observe troop movements. When German General Hans Kramer was released from British captivity in a prisoner exchange in May 1944, the Allies staged a brilliant spectacle. He was driven to southwest England, where troops were actually massing for the Normandy landings, but along the way, they constantly misspelled place names, mentioning towns in southeastern England. All the road signs were replaced. Kramer genuinely believed he was driving through the southeastern counties and saw a massive troop concentration. Returning to Germany, he immediately reported to his old friend, Field Marshal Rommel. The invasion would take place in the Pas-de-Calais. The Germans trusted one of their best generals unconditionally. Operation Fortitude was a triumph of military psychology. The Allies didn't just deceive the enemy, they fed their expectations, confirmed their assumptions, and fed them precisely the information they wanted to hear. And the Germans took the bait completely. The Ghost Army in southeast England looked impressive, but the most deadly weapon of Operation Fortitude wasn't rubber tanks, but real people. Double agents, spies recruited by German intelligence but secretly working for the British. It was the most dangerous game in the history of espionage. One mistake, one inaccuracy in the cover story, one out-of-place word, and an agent could end up in a Gestapo cellar. But it was these people, balancing on the brink of life and death, who became the main conduits of lies to German headquarters. British counterintelligence, MI5, created the double-cross system early in the war. Its purpose was to identify German spies in Britain and subsequently recruit them. By 1944, the British controlled virtually the entire German intelligence network on the islands. The Abwehr thought it was receiving reliable intelligence from its agents. In fact, every report was meticulously compiled by MI5 officers. 3 key agents were selected for Operation Fortitude, each playing a unique role in the grand deception. The first and most valuable was a man codenamed Garbo, Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard with an incredibly inventive mind and acting talent. Pujol hated fascism, and as early as 1941 had decided to contribute to the fight against Hitler. He offered his services to British intelligence, but was rejected as too suspicious. Then Pujol did the unthinkable. He recruited himself into the Abwehr, convincing the Germans he was willing to work for them as an agent in Britain. Having received money, instructions, and communications equipment from the Germans, he left not for England, but for Lisbon, where, from a public library, he began sending completely fictitious reports about British military installations to Berlin. Garbo described life in Britain so realistically, using guidebooks and newspapers as his sources, that the Germans believed him completely. Moreover, the Abwehr considered him one of their best agents. When British intelligence intercepted his messages and realized what was happening, they immediately transferred Pujol to London and enrolled him in the double-cross system. From that moment on, the Garbo legend began. He created a fictitious network of 27 sub-agents across Britain, an officer in the Ministry of Information, a railway employee in Glasgow, a radical Welsh nationalist, a Venezuelan student, a waitress in a military canteen. All these people existed only in Pujol's imagination, but through them he conveyed to the Germans a carefully calibrated mixture of truth and lies. Before Operation Fortitude, Garbo became the primary source of information about Patton's fictitious army. His agents reported on Fusag movements, the arrival of new divisions, and the preparation of landing ships in Kentish ports. Each report contained enough factual detail to appear credible, but pointed to the Pas-de-Calais as the invasion target. The Germans trusted Garbo so much that they ignored conflicting information from other sources. When the Normandy landings began, it was Garbo who convinced the German command that it was merely a diversion and that the real attack would follow a few days later in the Pas-de-Calais. For this work, the Nazis awarded him the Iron Cross. And after the war, the British awarded him the title of Member of the Order of the British Empire. Garbo remains the only person in history to have received the highest decorations from both sides in a war. The second key agent was Roman Czerniawski, codenamed Brutus. A Polish officer, he created the Inter Alia intelligence network in France, working for the Allies. In 1941, the Gestapo arrested him, and the Germans offered him a deal: his life in exchange for work for the Abwehr. Czerniawski agreed, arrived in Britain disguised as a German spy, and immediately surrendered to MI5. The British gained a ready-made channel to Berlin and an experienced intelligence officer. Brutus transmitted reports on the British armed forces, and the Germans considered his information extremely valuable. As part of Fortitude, he corroborated Garbo's data, creating a cross-checking effect. When two independent sources report the same thing, the information is perceived as absolutely reliable. The third was Dusan Popov, Tricycle, a Yugoslav lawyer whose lavish lifestyle concealed a stellar career as a double agent. Popov had been recruited by the Abwehr before the war and successfully infiltrated the highest circles of British society. The Germans were unaware that he was working for MI6. Tricycle traveled between neutral countries, meeting with German intelligence officers and passing them disinformation, carefully laced with genuine but useless information. His contribution to Fortitude consisted of confirming through Portuguese and Spanish channels information about Allied plans to attack the Pas-de-Calais. Thanks to his social connections, rumors of the impending invasion spread through diplomatic circles, from where they inevitably leaked to German agents. Coordinating the work of all these agents required pinpoint precision. MI5's B1A counterintelligence department employed a team of officers who crafted scenarios for each report. The information had to be plausible, but not so sensitive as to arouse suspicion. Information that was too valuable could alert the Germans. Why would an agent have access to such data? Therefore, each message was carefully calibrated, important enough to appear valuable, but indirect enough to appear realistically obtained. And most importantly, the British could test the effectiveness of their deception in real time. The Allies cracked the German Enigma encryption system back in 1940, thanks to the work of cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. Project Ultra allowed them to decipher secret messages from the Abwehr and Wehrmacht. When Garbo or Brutus sent a message, the British intercepted and deciphered the reply messages from Berlin a few days later. They observed how the German command responded to disinformation, whether they believed it, and what conclusions they drew. It was a closed-loop deception system. Send a lie, test the reaction, and adjust the next batch of lies. Never before in the history of warfare had such a mechanism for controlling disinformation existed. The Allies didn't simply deceive the enemy, they observed how the enemy was being deceived, and they controlled the process with surgical precision. By early June 1944, German intelligence was absolutely convinced. The invasion would take place in Pas-de-Calais in mid-July under the command of General Patton. All sources, radio intercepts, intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner testimony, pointed to the same thing. The Germans saw exactly what the Allies wanted to see. The trap was sprung. In the spring of 1944, dozens of intelligence reports lay on the desk of Reichsmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West. They all pointed to one thing. The Allies were amassing a colossal army in southeastern England, and the attack would come at the Pas-de-Calais. The Abwehr, under the command of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, received reports from its best agents in Britain, Garbo, Brutus, and Tricycle. Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance brought back photographs of tank and aircraft concentrations. Radio intelligence intercepted communications from the U.S. 1st Army Group headquarters. German intelligence officers, comparing data from various sources, saw a perfect picture. A massive concentration of forces opposite the narrowest section of the English Channel. The logic was ironclad. The geography was obvious. The intelligence was convincing. The Germans believed it completely. But not everyone in the German command was so confident. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for the defense of the French coast, understood that the Allies might try to deceive them. He insisted on strengthening the defenses along the entire Atlantic Wall, including Normandy. Rommel personally inspected the beaches, ordered the installation of anti-landing obstacles, the laying of mines on the shores, and the construction of pillboxes. But he, too, believed that the main attack would come on the Pas-de-Calais. Rommel was simply experienced enough to hedge his bets. He knew that if the enemy landed, they could only be driven back into the sea in the first few hours, before the landing force had consolidated its position on the beach. After that, it would be too late. But Rommel did not have the authority to freely move troops. The decisions were made by Hitler and his staff in Berlin. The Führer himself was absolutely convinced that the Allies would attack Pas-de-Calais. Moreover, Hitler considered himself a military genius, capable of intuitively understanding the enemy's intentions. He repeatedly told his generals, "They will strike at the narrowest point of the strait. This is the only sensible plan." When some officers suggested a Normandy landing, Hitler dismissed their concerns. The Abwehr supported the Führer. Their best agents reported on preparations for an invasion in the Pas-de-Calais region. After meeting with Hitler on May 27, 1944, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, Hiroshi Oshima, sent a dispatch to Tokyo outlining the Führer's certainty. The main attack would occur in the Pas-de-Calais region, and any actions elsewhere would be mere diversionary maneuvers. British intelligence intercepted and decrypted this message. The Allies knew. The deception had worked at the highest levels. Based on this data, the German command made a fateful decision about the distribution of forces. The 15th Army, the most powerful German force in France, was concentrated in the Pas-de-Calais region. The best divisions, the most modern tanks, and the strongest fortifications were located there. In Normandy, the 7th Army, significantly weaker, with fewer armored vehicles and artillery, held the defense. The Germans also held powerful SS Panzer divisions in reserve, but only Hitler could issue the order to deploy them. This centralization of command would prove a fatal mistake. When the landings began, the generals on the ground would be unable to quickly deploy reinforcements because they would be waiting for permission from Berlin. And Hitler would continue to believe that Normandy was a diversionary maneuver. On the morning of June 6, 1944, at 6:30 a.m., Operation Overlord began. The first waves of Allied landings hit the Normandy beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Paratroopers landed behind German lines. Warships opened a hurricane of fire on German fortifications. D-Day had begun, but the German command didn't understand what was happening. They had received reports of the Normandy landings and had seen the scale of the operation, but they didn't believe this was the main attack. Throughout the previous night, the Allies had conducted a series of diversionary operations. Dummy paratroopers were dropped over the Pas-de-Calais, recording gunfire and explosions. Small ships with radar reflectors simulated a massive invasion fleet heading for the Pas-de-Calais. German radars were recording what looked like a large-scale operation in the area where it was expected. In the critical first hours after the landings, the German command remained paralyzed with uncertainty. Rommel wasn't even there. He'd gone to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that the invasion would not happen given the bad weather. When he was awakened by news of the landing, he immediately returned to France, but lost precious hours. Rundstedt requested permission to commit tank reserves to the battle, but Hitler was asleep, and no one dared wake him. When the Führer awoke and learned of the landings, he declared, "I knew it. This is a diversionary operation. The real invasion will be in the Pas-de-Calais." He forbade the transfer of troops from the Pas-de-Calais area, fearing that that was when the Allies would launch their main attack. And here, Garbo entered the picture with the most brilliant move of the entire Operation Fortitude. On the night of June 8-9, he sent an urgent report to Berlin, marked extremely important. His fictitious agents allegedly confirmed that the Normandy landings were a feint. The real invasion, under Patton's command, would take place in the Pas-de-Calais in the coming days. Fusag was ready to launch across the Channel. The Germans must hold their troops in place and not transfer them to Normandy. This message arrived at precisely the right moment, when the German command was hesitating. Garbo was so convincing that his report was delivered personally to Hitler. The Führer immediately ordered, "The 15th Army remains in the Pas-de-Calais. Wait for the real invasion." This directive saved thousands of Allied lives. While the Germans held their best divisions in anticipation of a non-existent attack, Allied troops dug in on the Normandy beaches. The 7th Army resisted desperately, but without reinforcements, they could not stop the advance. The Allies expanded their beachhead, concentrated their forces, and unloaded equipment and supplies. By the time the Germans realized that Normandy was indeed an invasion, it was too late. The Allies had created an impregnable beachhead, and dislodging them was impossible. Operation Fortitude continued even after D-Day. The Germans held troops in the Pas-de-Calais for several more weeks, fearing a second attack. Illusion proved stronger than reality. The Phantom Army tied down real German divisions. Rubber tanks held the Wehrmacht's steel panzers at bay. A single Spanish actor with a brilliant imagination controlled the decisions of the German General Staff. It was a new type of war, a war of information against force, deception against logic, illusion against reality, and illusion triumphed. By the end of July 1944, the German 15th Army was still standing in the Pas-de-Calais region, awaiting an invasion that would never come. 18 divisions, some 150,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces were hobbled by a non-existent threat. They weren't fighting in Normandy. They were guarding the coast from a phantom army. Only by the end of July, 7 weeks after the landings, did the German command finally understand. There would be no second invasion. Fusag was a sham. Garbo had deceived them. But it was too late. The Allies captured and expanded the bridgehead, broke through the German defenses, and began a rapid advance deep into France. The German group in Normandy found itself encircled in the so-called Falaise Pocket, where it was virtually destroyed. The casualty figures speak volumes about the success of Operation Fortitude. From June 6 to August 30, 1944, the Allies lost 209,672 men in Normandy, 36,976 of whom were killed. The losses were heavy, particularly on Omaha Beach, where approximately 1,700 died on the first day. but they were significantly lower than they would have been without the successful deception operation. The Germans lost over 450,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, and captured. More than 40 divisions were destroyed. The German Western Front effectively ceased to exist. Had German troops from Pas-de-Calais been transferred to Normandy in the first days after the landings, the Allies would have faced enemy forces more than twice their size. Defensive battles could have dragged on for months. Losses would have been catastrophic, and the outcome of the operation would have been in serious doubt. Military historians are unanimous. Operation Fortitude was one of the most successful deception operations in the history of warfare. It saved tens of thousands of Allied lives and accelerated the liberation of Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, stated after the war, "The deception operation was so successful that the Germans maintained a strong force in the Pas-de-Calais until the end of July, which greatly facilitated our task in Normandy." British historian John Masterman, who oversaw the double-cross system, wrote in his memoirs, "Never before in the history of intelligence had deception been carried out with such precision and on such a scale." What made Fortitude so effective? Several factors converged. First, the operation was complex and multi-layered. The Allies didn't rely on a single channel of disinformation. They used physical props, radio games, double agents, diplomatic leaks, and even the testimony of specially liberated prisoners of war. Each channel corroborated information from other sources, creating the illusion of authenticity. Second, the British had a unique advantage. They deciphered German codes through Project Ultra and could monitor in real time whether the Germans believed their deceptions and adjust their strategy. Third, the Allies exploited enemy psychology. The Germans themselves wanted to believe that the invasion would take place in the Pas-de-Calais. This suited their logic, their strategic calculations. The Allies simply gave them the information they expected to hear. But there were also lessons that shouldn't be forgotten. The success of Fortitude depended largely on enemy mistakes. Hitler centralized command and denied local generals autonomy. German intelligence relied too heavily on its agents, unaware that they were all working for the enemy. The Abwehr failed to detect the cracking of the Enigma ciphers. If even one of these systems had worked correctly, the deception could have failed. Modern military analysts study Operation Fortitude not only as a success story, but also as a warning. Never rely on a single source of information. Always cross-check. Always consider the possibility of deception. After the war, the fates of those involved in the operation varied. Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbo's agent, faked his death in 1949 and fled to Venezuela, where he lived until 1984, when historian Nigel West tracked him down. Garbo gave several interviews in which he spoke about his role in the war and died in 1988. Roman Chernyavsky, aka Brutus, remained in British intelligence and later became a journalist. Dusan Popov, aka Tricycle, wrote a memoir and claimed to have served as the inspiration for James Bond. Ian Fleming was indeed aware of his activities, although there is no direct evidence of this. Colonel John Bevan received a knighthood and quietly retired, never publicly speaking about his work. Operation Fortitude remained secret until the 1970s. The British government gradually declassified the documents, and the world learned of the scale of the deception. Today, inflatable tanks from that operation stand in World War II museums, and Garbo's story is taught in intelligence schools as an example of ideal intelligence work. In 2019, the original radio used by Garbo to communicate with the Germans was auctioned off. It was bought by a private collector for $70,000. The memory of the operation lives on not only in books and films, but also in the very philosophy of modern military intelligence. What can we learn from this story today? Operation Fortitude demonstrated a simple yet powerful truth. Information can be a weapon more destructive than tanks and bombers. In today's world, Where information warfare has become the norm, the lessons of 1944 are more relevant than ever. Disinformation, fake news, and the manipulation of public opinion, these are all tools honed during World War II. The only difference is that back then, general staffs were deceived, while today, entire nations are deceived. Operation Fortitude demonstrated that the most powerful army is a lie the enemy believes, and the most dangerous weakness is the inability to distinguish truth from illusion. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy and changed the course of history. But this victory wasn't just the bravery of the soldiers storming the fortified beaches under a hail of bullets. It was also the result of a brilliant deception operation in which rubber tanks tied down steel divisions and a single Spaniard with a typewriter proved more dangerous than an entire army. Operation Fortitude, Operation Dreaming, proved that sometimes the greatest battles are won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the decision-makers, and that the most terrible weapon of war is the enemy's belief in the lies you've created for them.